Welcome everyone to our talk on remote facilitation. Kirsten and I care a lot about remote meetings and how to make them more impactful and more effective. And so for today, we just hope that you feel a little bit more confident and a little bit more inspired in your remote facilitation. And we'll share a little bit about both some principles and some practical tips that you can take away today. Next slide. So who are we? As mentioned, we are co-authors of the Remote Facilitators Pocket Guide. We also love to speak on the topic of remote facilitation. It's a topic that we both really care about. And we are both working as team Agile coaches for IO, which is a German-based company. And you can follow us on social media at Remote Better. We tweet quite a bit about things that we're doing and some free slide decks. And we are joining you all the way from Cape Town, South Africa. So thank you for having us. We are super excited. So next slide. So what can you expect from today? So we first want to dig a little bit into some of the challenges. What are the challenges faced in remote meetings? And we'll explain a little bit of what is going on for people, some of the science of the brain behind that. And then we have two principles that we'd like to share for you. So the first principle we'll share a little bit of a story. We'll talk about what that principle means to us, and then we'll share some practical methods that support that principle. So what practical things can you do to make that principle a reality? And then we'll have the very same format for principle number 2. We'll share a story, we'll share what that principle means, and some practical methods. What you can also expect is that we'll do a little bit of silent exploration. And so I'm introducing it now because sometimes people think that we're frozen on the call because we're not saying anything. But in reality, we just really want to give people some time to explore, like, what does this practically look like, and to digest some of the information. But we will cue you when we get there, just so you know what to expect. But first, we'd like to know, what do you find challenging or difficult in remote meetings? And we'd like to use this opportunity for you to just share in the chat, as your personal experience, what do you find difficult in remote meetings? Whoa, that is going so fast. So I saw lack of engagement, lack of body cues, people keeping their focus, staying engaged, reading faces, engagement, attention. Lots of people saying engagement, actually. So more time and energy. Yeah, participation. People talking over each other. No visible cues. No faces, Zoom fatigue. Sure. Few breaks. Yeah, so 100%. It looks like there are so many challenges. This is why we like to highlight some of the challenges, because a lot of people tend to focus on what are the benefits of remote meetings, like what is the benefits of remote meetings. But we want to sort of help you through what are some of the challenges. What are they first, identifying them, and then what can you do about them?
Yeah. So over to me. So as Jay mentioned, we're going to spend a little bit of time now exploring the challenges, because as she mentioned, and as the chat is very clearly showing, there are lots of challenges. And what we have found is that we all have intuitions about what's going wrong. You're in a remote meeting and you can kind of feel it going off center, or you can feel things aren't going the way you want them to, but you just don't quite have a language for what's going on. And so what we'd like to do here is share our hypothesis with you and some theory. And then when we share our principles, you'll probably be able to come up with your own by that stage anyway. And our underlying hypothesis here is really that it's just a lot harder to create the conditions for safety in remote spaces. And there's a whole bunch of things that accidentally happen. Very little of it is intentional, but there's all these sorts of accidental things that creep into remote meetings and make the conditions of the space itself that much harder to create those which you need for collaboration. And to go a little bit deeper into this, we're going to talk a little bit about the brain. Some of you may be familiar with this, so apologies if you are. But to start us off, I'd like to think about the brain, or at least one way of thinking about it, is as this big threat reward detection mechanism. And what I mean by that is, in any given situation, Jay, I think you might be breathing. Not that it's a problem, but just FYI. In any given situation, what your brain is doing constantly is trying to determine, am I safe or am I not safe? So as you're driving, where you're scanning the situation, is there possible threat or is there possible reward? And it happens completely unconsciously, right? And what a lot of research has shown is there's two interesting things about this process when it starts happening. The first one is that as human beings, we're just much more likely to detect threat than we are reward. It's kind of just how we're wired. And the way that I sometimes think about that is, if people walk past me in the street and they look at me out the side of their eye, I'm often way more likely to detect that as being, oh, are they looking at my clothes? Did they think something's wrong with me? Are they judging me? Your brain doesn't go to, oh, they're looking at me because they want to be my friend. We are much more primed to detect threats in situations. And some people say that's probably because that's what kept us safe from an evolutionary perspective. Our ability to detect threat keeps us safe, whereas our ability to detect chocolate cake or whatever doesn't really help from that perspective. So the first thing to have in our minds is that our brains are super likely to detect things as threatening and very unlikely to feel safe, just as a default. And the second thing, which is why the threat arrow is so much bigger, is that the threat response in the brain and the body is felt much more strongly and lasts much longer. And what we mean by that is the chemicals that get released stay around in the body for longer, and the experience is felt much more strongly. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into what that experience is now. And this will be the last bit of neuroscience because you possibly weren't expecting it in a facilitation talk, but we think it's useful in detangling some of the fuzz of remote meetings. And so there's two parts of the brain that are highlighted here, and they're both involved in this dynamic which we're speaking about. And so the prefrontal cortex is that part of the brain that we want to access in remote meetings. It's the part that's responsible for rational, complex, creative thinking. Whereas the limbic system, most of us are familiar with as the fight, flight, or freeze response. That's where we go when we're feeling unsafe. And what's interesting is when people begin to detect threat, and they may not be conscious of it, it can be happening purely unconsciously, but when they begin to detect threat, resources start being directed away from the prefrontal cortex towards the limbic system. And that means that they are physically less able to access the kinds of thinking that are needed for this kind of complex creative work we're talking about. And to put that a different way, what we'd like to say here is that the conditions around us impact our cognition quality. All the things that are happening in the space around us impact the quality which we're able to think with. And taking that one step further, ultimately in meetings, what we're wanting is to achieve high quality outcomes. And that is dependent on people being able to think in a quality way. And so the point we're making here is that the brain kind of operates differently in different conditions. And as facilitators, if we can come with that awareness and start thinking about how can we create safety, or how can we take care of the conditions so that we're setting people up in a way that they can do their best quality thinking. And maybe this is sounding too abstract, so what we're going to do here is talk about 3 scenarios that you might relate to in a remote meeting. Because ultimately, it's not one big thing that breaks remote meetings or makes remote collaboration hard. It's kind of the compound effect of lots of little small things that begin to form these cracks and make it harder and harder for people to feel safe. So maybe these scenarios feel safe. maybe everyone on the call speaks a different language to that which you speak at home, and you don't understand their jokes. And that begins to make you feel a little bit less like you're a part of the group, or a little bit safe there, a little bit less safe there. I'm lucky I speak English, but my company's main language is English, but I know that for the majority of people, that's not their home language. And it can be an othering experience not to be speaking the main language. Or maybe you're trying to speak and no one's hearing you. And you're trying and no one's hearing you, and you begin to feel threatened because of that, or this little bit of anxiety creeps up. And I'd hazard that 99% of the time, no one is doing that with malicious intent. It could be for technical reasons, or maybe they're also caught up in their million screens and things going on. But for whatever reason, you may begin to feel like the group's ignoring me, I'm not getting a chance to speak. And then now you're moving more towards a threat style state. Or maybe you just can't see how people are feeling and you feel so alone and you don't know how to react. Maybe you've had that experience where you dial onto a call and you try to make small talk. Hey, how's everyone doing? And it's just boom, silence, and you get no feedback. And again, it's not that people are doing that on purpose. It's just these weird remote meetings that we find ourselves in are much more likely to create that sense of anxiety and threat. So, if it's not one big thing, it's the compound effect of all these little invisible things that begin to nudge us into places that aren't helpful. And what we're going to do now, because we know that was quite a lot, is we're going to just pause, as Jay mentioned, in silence to give you a little bit of a breather to assimilate what's coming to mind for you. So we're just going to have a minute's silence now and allow you the chance to reflect on what is standing out for you. As an introvert, I love silence, but I also know that a lot of people aren't comfortable with silence on calls, so maybe it'll feel more comfortable as we go. But I think we can move on then, hey Jay?
Yeah. Okay, so now we've just spoken a little bit about challenges and what's happening there. But now we'll move on to our very first principle. And before we get stuck into, no, you can go, sorry. Before we get stuck into what this principle is about, we want to do a quick Menti. So we're answering the question, what facilitation principles are important in remote meetings? And to do this, if you have your phone nearby, you can either go to menti.com and type in the code, which is 9686918. Or if you have the appropriate app or an iPhone, you can just scan the QR code, which should take you to that particular Menti. And so we just have one question we'd like to answer, which is what facilitation principles are important in remote meetings? And Kirsten will be sharing the live results now.
I always love doing this because there's so many good ideas that come up. So we'll take screenshots of this also so you can access these later and harvest it for ideas.
I see listening coming through a few times. Inclusion and variety. Respecting perspective, safety.
I like that one, grace. I once joined a call and the facilitator said, let's just give people some grace while they figure out their technical things and joining. And I was like, oh, that's such a nice way to start a call, giving people some grace.
Sure, there's so many. This is great. We would usually take a screenshot, but because there's so many, we're probably going to have to do it afterwards and add it to the slides. Everyone has equal opportunity. Someone has snuck ahead.
I love it that everyone is participating. That's great.
Yeah, this is really great. Okay. Thanks everybody for your participation. It's really great to see all of that feedback. But we can continue. We will post the results in here afterwards. But to explain our first principle, we like to share a quick little metaphor or story to help illustrate the point. So in Cape Town, South Africa, where we're from, well, maybe not Cape Town, but South Africa, going on safari can be quite a popular thing, especially for tourists. So I'm going to assume that the majority of people know what going on safari is. So just imagine for a moment, you've booked a safari tour because you're coming to visit Kirsten and I. And so you booked this tour and you thought, oh, what a good price. But when you arrived, it turned out that you were given a rickety bicycle to take your safari on. And you look at the landscape and you see the road has kind of got lots of potholes in it. There's wild animals lurking far away. The weather's not looking so great. And next to you, this lovely family has this beautiful 4x4. And as they drive off, they wave to you and wish you good luck on your lovely bicycle. And you're just thinking, oh goodness, what have I done? So we want you to imagine for a minute what it would like experiencing safari on a rickety bicycle. You're probably not going to have a good time. Not only is it unsafe for you, but it's also uncomfortable, and the experience is just not as you should experience it. So we like to think that the vehicle you use contributes to experience. And so similar in a remote meetings, if everyone is entering the remote meeting with a different context or tools, the experience is going to be quite different. Some might have a better experience than others. So it's really difficult in our example to experience a safari in a rickety bicycle than a 4x4. And so what is that rickety bicycle in remote meetings? This might look like people in a room having a conversation with each other while one or two people are remote and can't really hear the conversation. It might look like somebody has a really bad connection and they're unable to turn the video on, and so their experience will be a little bit different than anybody else. So what we want to share is that if someone is invited to your meeting to solve a problem or to contribute, they should be part of the decision making. Or sorry, if they are part of the decision making, it's important that you hear their voice. It's important that your environment enables them to contribute their voice. And so what we're speaking about here is creating equal opportunity. So we believe that the quality of outcomes is dependent on the quality of conversation as well as the diversity of voices and opinions. Creating equal opportunity in meetings is ensuring that as far as possible, everybody has the same experience and the same opportunity to contribute. And so we also like to ask the question, how likely is it that the group will defend outcomes if they weren't part of the decision-making process? And so what we're saying with creating equal opportunity is we're not saying that everybody has to have equal weight or even authority. We're just saying where possible, as facilitators, you should provide a space where all people can be heard or can contribute. So what does this look like practically? So we want to just share some of our practical, before we get to practical tips, I think this is Kirsten sharing some pictures.
Yes, sorry. This was again to contextualize it, and we shared the metaphor of the car, but maybe thinking back to meetings, what might it look like again, right? So maybe the conversation is moving too fast for people, and because it's not their native tongue, they're not able to keep up. That could be one way or one thing you can pay attention to in creating equal opportunity. Or maybe this scene feels familiar. No one's noticed that your connection's dropping and you can't follow. So what can we as facilitators do to cater for those kind of scenarios and create equal opportunity? Or maybe, as Jay mentioned, you're the only one calling in, and that screen you see in the background, there's just one lonely face there, and you can't really hear what people are saying. You can see from their body language that they're joking, but you don't really have an equal opportunity to participate. So what we're going to share now is some practical ideas for how you might create equal opportunity.
Yeah, and so one important thing that I just want to share here is that these are some ideas of how to create equal opportunity, and by no means are they all, but they're just some of our ideas. And so the first is a virtual writing mechanism. I've been in remote meetings where people are often vocal, like that's often the default, is to be vocal and outspoken and to speak over everyone. So providing a space for people to be able to write down their thoughts and opinions for a little bit of quiet time can go a long way in allowing everybody sort of to have their voice. So one thing I want to mention here is that this can also help where people are second language speakers to the language that the meeting is held in. It gives people also a little bit of time to think and process and add this stuff via writing than to just simply rely on verbal communication. The second one is going fully remote. So we know with COVID, this might not be a problem right now, but we've heard that a lot of companies are looking to go hybrid when we go back to normal, if that ever happens, where companies might split, where some people are remote, some people are co-located. And we really want to share here is that going fully remote can really help equalize the way the meeting happens. So even when I worked a couple of years ago with a team where one or two people were in another country, we all joined calls and participated in our own machines. And that allowed each person to both participate, but also to experience the meeting exactly the same as somebody else. So if one person has trouble connecting, everybody knows what that pain feels like because they can hear that, they can experience that. And as we mentioned, it's not one big group in a meeting speaking over each other where one person is remote. The third one which is pseudo body, might seem a little bit radical, but we like to use this in special occasions. So, for example, when there's a meeting that's high stakes and almost everybody can be in a room together, but there's only one or two people that are remote, and you really feel that for this meeting, it would really help if people have a co-located conversation. So what we've done in the past is get a person that has absolutely no stake in the meeting whatsoever, come in and act as the remote person, so act as a pseudo body. And that person's responsibility would be to be completely at the disposal of the remote person. So they would translate what people are saying in case there's a drop in connection or the person can't hear. They will take photos, they'll walk around with a laptop. They've even had a photo of the remote person on their body or their laptop just to make that person's presence known. And obviously this is an expensive option and it's not ideal to use all the time, but where necessary, where important, and you feel this is needed, it can be an option.
All right, so, and just a warning, my dogs have come home from a walk, so you'll probably meet them in a moment or hear them. So then the fourth one is allowing time for people to think or read. And I think a lot of the time we find ourselves in remote meetings, unfortunately often back to back, and there's kind of this inequality starting off because everyone's in different places. Some people have information fresh in their minds, others don't. And so giving people just some space, pausing, allowing people time to either think, for those of us who need some time to process first before we speak, giving people that time, or else giving people time to read. If there was some material, just giving them that space. And in so doing, you're bringing everyone onto the same sort of starting point. Another one which we will show practically what it could look like, because it might sound a bit abstract, but maybe there's a space in the meeting where you can pre-populate names. And that's kind of a direct invitation without making it too formal that everyone has a space in the meeting. Even if they're choosing not to speak, their presence is kind of held because their name is there and they are present. And we'll show some techniques. And obviously it kind of goes without saying, don't use all of these at once. Find the ones that work for you and try one or two at a time. And then the last one is one that I feel quite passionate about. I often find meetings, especially where we're trying to make a decision and looking through lots of options, people spend a lot of time talking and debating. And sometimes you find yourself 30, 40 minutes in and you're not actually clear on what the opinion or the general sentiment is. So finding a lightweight way for people to show opinion and then have a conversation from there creates equal opportunity, because without someone who maybe doesn't want to compete or speak as much, they can still show how they feel, either with the image, or we'll show some grids or decision matrices. But just thinking about maybe some lightweight ways to show opinion that don't involve a detailed debate right off the bat. So those are 6, as Jay mentioned. They're not a comprehensive list. They're just some to illustrate what creating equal opportunity could look like. And I think it's back to you, Jay.
Yeah, and so now we just want to allow you some time to silently explore what this might look like. So practically what you can do. We like to use Google Slides just for ease. And so Kirsten posted the link in the chat. So you can explore it on your own, but she will also go through the slides one by one slowly if you're unable to access Google Slides right now. So this is just silent exploration time.
I noticed someone raised their hand. We have time for questions at the end, but I just want to check someone's not having like access issues or anything. There was a hand raise. Okay, feel free to reach out in the chat if you're struggling, but we're going to pause, as Jay mentioned, for like 2-3 minutes silence, and I'm going to do a slow scroll. We also had not anticipated such a big audience, so if it reaches a point where you get bounced, you can look at my screen.
Definitely able to access it. And to your point, that yeah, we have 284 participants at this point.
Yeah, sorry. We will share this deck afterwards, and I'll scroll through it slowly now so you can see what everyone's looking at on my screen. Apologies.
And we'll post the deck on Swapcard as well.
Yeah.
I see we have almost 100 people that are accessing the deck at this point.
That's pretty cool. Okay. I hope the silent time was useful and a nice break. Just to reiterate, we will share those afterwards. It's also on the big click here button on the slide deck, which you will get. And I think then, Jay, unless there's anything else from your side, we can move on. No, alrighty. So we have gone through the challenges. We've spoken about how we can create equal opportunity, and now we're going to follow a similar sort of recipe and share our second principle with you. Just double checking you can still see the right screen. Hey, okay.
Yep.
All right, so Jay told a story about safari, and I'm going to tell a story about roads. And in South Africa, because our public transport isn't amazing, we rely quite heavily on driving, and most of us have our own car. And I know there's quite a few people dialing in from America, and I've got cousins in America, and I know there's some very long, very scary roads in America too. So maybe we have similar experiences. But for a moment, I'd like you to think about, if you are driving in a car, how do you make decisions on the road? Because driving is quite a complex activity, right? You're busy processing an awful lot of information at a very quick rate while making decisions which are very high stakes. And so how is it that we make decisions on the fly in that kind of a situation? And I think something we don't often think about is the importance of road signs. They're kind of these small, little, insignificant things that pass us by, but they serve a hugely valuable purpose. If you've ever driven on a road that's newly laid and doesn't have road markings, that can be a pretty scary experience, because not only are you trying to drive and do everything that comes with that, but you're also trying to figure out, am I in the right lane? Can I overtake? What are the rules here? Similarly, if you don't have any road signs, you're busy doing all the cognitive things of driving while also trying to remember, when is the next off-ramp? Where am I? All these extra things you have to hold in your mind. And if you think about it, that's really kind of the simple magic of road signs, is they declutter our brains. They take all the little things that we would have to be holding and remembering out of the way for us, so that we can access them when we need them. And for the rest of the time, we can just focus on driving. And this then brings us to like remote meetings, where there's so much going on in a remote space. There's so much more than in a co-located meeting. You're probably trying to manage your tech. You're managing a few screens. You're wondering if you can be heard. You're wondering if your background noise is as irritating for everyone else as it is for you. And there's kind of all these things going on. And maybe some of these scenarios feel like things that you've come across. Maybe some of the things that make it hard for you to navigate is you can't see how people are feeling. So should I keep talking or not? I can't see you. I can't figure out if I should keep going. And so now my driving through this meeting is becoming more complicated and stressful. Or maybe there's just a lot being held in your mind. So one of those meetings where there is no visual tool and everyone jumps on a call, and I have seen these where people speak for 2 hours, a group of like 10 people just speaking. And by the end, your brain's just bursting because you're trying to hold it all in your mind. And that's stressful and begins to really cloud and complexify, even though that's not a word, complexify the space. Or maybe it's something like this. The scenario I mentioned a little bit earlier, you leave the meeting still not quite with a clear picture of what we've agreed. Maybe the meeting just felt a little bit gray and there was lots of conversation, but you're not actually sure what was agreed. And all of these scenarios for us point to our second principle, which is guide with visuals. So how can we leverage the wisdom of road signs? Oh, my dogs now have a squeaky toy, sorry. How can we leverage the wisdom of road signs to make our meetings smoother experiences for people, to make traveling through the remote meeting a clearer, calmer, and more effective experience for people? And in a moment, we'll get into what that means. But what we like to think about here is how can you balance like over-cluttering the space with too many visuals versus just getting that right balance of the road sign logic, where there are these simple things that help people to move through the space without really thinking about them. And you're kind of taking away some of the complexity, some of the confusion by giving simple little road sign type things here and there so that people can be much more present and focused on the work that they're there to do, which is to collaborate. And again, we've got some practical things that we will share with you, and then we'll illustrate in a moment. And so the first one is simply visible instructions. So often in a remote meeting, you give an instruction, and then maybe someone's audio drops, or maybe they came a few minutes late, or maybe a notification popped up on their screen, they checked out for a second, and then they back and they missed it. So just whatever you said, just putting a visible line of it on the screen too, whether it's as simple as like, write X on a sticky, or we'll be here for 5 minutes doing Y, just reiterating it for people so that they don't have to try process all these things. The second one is simplifying talk order. So that's where sometimes in remote meetings it gets confusing just because we don't really have a way to navigate the absence of body language or the cues that we rely on. And that has an implication for talk order. So if people kind of speak over each other, it gets a bit more confusing. And then I want to say something, but I'm also busy thinking about how I can book my place in the conversation so that I can say my thing. And it's kind of where a simple road sign will help take that confusion or little distraction out of the way for people. So how can you as a group come to a simple way of just decluttering the space by agreeing a simple way to have a talk order? And that kind of ties into remote space agreements. This is relevant in teams, not just in meetings, but specifically in meetings. What we found is it doesn't actually matter what your agreements are. It just matters that the team has the conversation about them and finds ones that work for them, as well as bring some awareness to the need for them. Whether it's, I don't know, mute on entry, although a side note, I personally find if it's a small call of like 4 or 5 people, maybe you actually don't want to mute, because then it becomes awkward when people have to unmute, mute, unmute. It almost breaks the flow of conversation. So if you can afford to have everyone just talking naturally, that's nirvana. But otherwise, if it's a big call, it generally practically makes sense to mute or raise hand, or maybe it's everyone is responsible for note taking. So we all jump into the document, whatever the agreements are, just having that conversation at the start. Jay.
Okay, so the next is enrich information with visuals. So as Kirsten mentioned before, not cluttering the space with visuals, but how can you enhance what you're trying to say with visual information? Sometimes it might mean like adding a picture to describe like a potential metaphor that you'd like to add. Like maybe you're talking about planning and you want to focus on the road ahead. And so what does that look like in terms of just adding a layer of letting people interpret information with visuals? Something I also like to do when I'm facilitating with a big whiteboard space, for example, and I have different sections, is add icons just to allow people to quickly identify like, oh, this is the space you're talking to in this big whiteboard, or this is the space or area I have to go. And also just like adding visuals to sort of help people communicate, so or help them add information or engage with the slides or the board. And the last one is just visually validating outcomes. And this is one that might seem the simplest to do, but it's one that people often forget to do. So something simple as a table that says, what is the action or the outcome that we've agreed to? When are we going to do it? And who's going to do it? It doesn't even have to be a table, but just making sure that everybody walks away with the same page. Something that I'd like to add here is that people don't intentionally leave meetings like pretending to remember different things. Sometimes people just genuinely remember things differently. And sometimes people leave the meeting thinking, oh, is this person going to set up the next meeting? Was it supposed to be me? I can't really remember. So visually validating those outcomes can be super useful. Yeah, and so now we'll show you practically what that can look like. So I will share the deck in the chat. And then once more, you're free to click on the chat and explore for yourself in quiet time. but Kirsten will also scroll through slowly.
I see we might be at our cap again, so apologies. Okay. I saw some questions coming through. These decks will be available indefinitely, and we have a few more which are like pretty much open. So yes, you can access them whenever and use them as you wish. And now what we're going to do is we're going to allow another pause. Another pause and invite you to share in the Zoom chat what is coming to mind for you now from where we started at the beginning of our journey, talking about threat and reward, two principles and some stories. What is on your mind now? We're curious to hear in the Zoom chat, and then we'll wrap up. Cool. Thank you very much for the feedback. It's nice to hear what stood out for people. The simplicity or using the tools. There were also some questions coming through, so we might have some time at the end. But thank you very much for sharing. And over to you, Jay.
Yeah, and so just in summary of what we covered today. So first we looked at challenges. We asked you to share some of yours. We spoke about what might be happening for people and how these challenges might occur. And then we spoke about our first principle, which was create equal opportunity. We shared the lovely safari metaphor and what it might feel like to be in a remote meeting in a different vehicle. And then we shared some practical methods on what you can use to create equal opportunity in your own meetings. And we've just now covered principle 2, which is guide with visuals. The story about road signs and how that helps you to navigate remote meetings. And then we shared some practical examples of what that might look like. And so that's our talk for this evening. So we just want to say thank you so much to everybody. Thank you for joining us. You can contact us either via email at info@remotecoaches.com or on Twitter @remotebetter. And yeah, and that is all for this evening.